What is up, weather enthusiasts? I'm your host, Pat's Path Predictor. Let's get right into the weather. Alright, so here's the situation we have for you, ladies and gentlemen. We were talking yesterday about the Colorado State University putting out a bunch of forecasts and a few other things that we were talking about. This video is going to kind of be a bit more of a going over of when this hurricane season is going to ramp up. It is currently July 11th right now, so we are in a bit of a quiet phase as of right now in the tropical Atlantic and surprisingly in the Pacific too. But considering that we are moving into a La Nina as of right now, I'm not necessarily that surprised. We'll get right into that in just a second. But before we do that, we have our area of interest to watch right here. 10% chance of formation in the next 48 hours and 7 days. It's going to be producing a lot of heavy rainfall for much of the Carolinas over the next little while. I want to go ahead and pull up the COD models just to kind of see what they're forecasting, at least for that part of the country. Let's go ahead and use the European, at least for right now. We can go ahead and see precipitation, total precip accumulation. From this, yeah, they're expecting about 2 to 3 inches of rain across much of the Carolinas right here, so we're definitely going to have to pay very close attention to that. And as we get more information and as we get more data, what is the GFS saying? GFS wants potentially 3 to 4 inches across much of North Carolina, especially around the Wilmington area and areas around Rocky Mount areas closer to Raleigh and I believe that's Johnston County and all those areas right there. So we'll have to pay attention to that. The GEM model, we can go ahead and pull that up. Yeah, pretty healthy amount of rain right there. North American model, we can go ahead and zoom in on this real quickly. Yeah, they're advocating for a lot of rain in the Carolinas. So this looks like a very big flash flooding threat. Regardless of what we're looking at, the main threat's going to be in the Carolinas, South Carolina, North Carolina, predominantly from Myrtle Beach all the way to the Outer Banks. That's when the greatest threat is going to be, and it's going to be going on during the weekend, so we're going to have to pay attention to that. I know Ethan WX is going to North Carolina, so I'm sure he's not going to be too happy about the weather right now, but please just go ahead and have some fun with what you have, buddy. I understand. Anyway, let's go ahead and dive right into the main meat of this video about when this hurricane season is going to ramp up, what the timetable potentially looks like, and what we're going to be seeing and how active it's going to get. We already kind of talked about how active it's going to get in yesterday's video. If you haven't checked it out, there's going to be a link in the description to that, just so that way you guys can get caught up on it. But if you have seen that video and you're looking at this one, well, congratulations. Now you know we have a very active hurricane season on our hands. Colorado State University put out a forecast of 25 named storms, 12 hurricanes, 6 majors, TSR 6, 13, and 6 respectively. So that's essentially what we're looking at, and those forecasts have trended up, and CSU's forecast took into account Hurricane Beryl, and that's why the accumulative cyclonic energy, thank you for the person in the comments that let me know about this, accumulated cyclonic energy, that's why it went up in both forecasts. Because the ACE generated by Beryl was so extreme, it kind of just pulled the forecasts up with it. So anyway, that's what we're dealing with at this current point. Essentially, what we're looking at is a timetable of pretty much when the shear is going to calm down, when the dry air is going to calm down, and when the ITCZ fully flares up. So because we can see right here, yes, the ITCZ is kind of a bit of a quiet phase right now. It has been for the last 24 hours or so. Definitely some moist air in the region over there, but we are going to see a more active ITCZ starting to flare up in the next few weeks or so, so we're going to have to pay attention to that. And the reason we're paying attention to the intertropical convergence zone is what the ITCZ does is in the general vicinity, it produces a lot of moisture. And moisture is one of the key elements you need for tropical cyclone formation. You need moisture, very warm waters over 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. That's generally around the magic number or so. You need very little dry air. You need, I already mentioned that. You need low wind shear. You need vorticity, and you need essentially a mechanism to start all this. You need a tropical wave for that. So the tropical waves that are coming off Africa right now, they're going to be in an area of about, I'd say, somewhat unfavorable conditions because, yeah, it's in moist air, but there is a bit of wind shear, at least in the extreme eastern part of the main development region that my guys at Storms United have been paying attention to. We can go ahead and pull that up for you right here. Yeah, there's quite a bit of wind shear in the extreme eastern part of the main development region, so we're going to have to pay attention to that as we get more data and more information. And remember, we're going to see a lot of these fluctuations over this month. We're going to see a lot of up and down, down, off and on wind shear values, and it's going to be Atlantic-wide. The reason I'm mentioning this is typical for July. We're going to see a lot of oscillations with the wind shear, but those oscillations are going to be downtrending. It's going to go like this, and then it's going to go down. It's going to only go back up to here in 1 week, and it's going to go down to here in another week, and it's going to go down further and further below my camera screen right there. So that's what we're dealing with right here. We're seeing a downtrend of the wind shear. I've started to notice this around the third week of June, honestly, which is it's uncharacteristically early for that to happen. Because typically, yeah, you do see a lot of fluctuations in June, but generally the average holds steady, and the average is still relatively pretty high. But right before Beryl started to organize and develop, you did start to notice, at least Atlantic-wide, a downtrending of the shear. It was very subtle at first, but as Beryl started to organize and develop, you started to see that wind shear just completely collapse. And we saw a lot of the forecast models calling for a much less shear than average for the Caribbean, because where the Caribbean is right now, it's in that graveyard situation where a tropical cyclone will get torn apart in 40 to 50 knots of wind shear right there. That's just pretty much inevitable if it gets into that. But what we were seeing for a period of about, I'd say 1 or 2 weeks or so, was essentially this not existing and Beryl charging through as a Category 4 and Category 5 hurricane through much of the Caribbean. And yes, this did come back, but honestly, the question now is how long is it going to stay? And matter of fact, let's go ahead and pull up the shear forecast now that I mentioned this, because I want to see what this is, what the average is looking like, at least in that region of the Caribbean Sea over there. Let's go ahead and pull this up right here, the 200 to 850 millibar wind shear. Let's go ahead and pull up the anomalies. This is the 5-day average. It's right now, it is around average, but in the eastern Caribbean, it is below average. It's below average by a bit of a concerning number right there. And you see this happening in the next few days or so. You start to see pretty much the wind shear values start to decrease, at least anomaly-wise, across much of the Caribbean Sea. And even in the Gulf of Mexico, you're starting to see around average or even just a little bit below average wind shear. So we're going to have to pay attention to that, and you kind of start seeing that. And again, you're going to see fluctuations, but there's two key areas that are starting to see that decrease of wind shear, at least with the anomalies. You're going to see that with the main development region, and you're seeing that in the Caribbean Sea over here. And that's a little concerning to take a look at least for right now. But right now is right now. We're going to have to wait and see how this whole thing plays out. But at least when it comes to the oscillation-wise, and at least when it comes to shear, the shear is going to be downtrending. There's really no disputing about that. And matter of fact, we see a large area of little to no wind shear across much of the Atlantic basin in about 3 or 4 days or so, which, again, that's not going to amount to much right now because it is still July. There is still the Sahara air layer, which we'll get to in a second, that's going to be persisting and everything like that. But the fact that we're seeing this is something, an environment I would typically see, I'd say, around early August or so. Because, yes, there is still a little bit of wind shear in the Caribbean Sea. Yes, there's still a little bit of wind shear in the Atlantic Basin over here. But this looks to me like an early August setup right here. And as you can see on the screen right here, this is forecasted for July 14th, which is telling me is one of two things. It's either telling me that A, the shear is ahead of schedule, or B, the ENSO neutral and La Nina is kicking in. It's one of those two things right there. So we're going to have to pay attention to that. And speaking of which, I believe they did release their next forecast. Yes, they did. They released their July 2024 forecast, at least for that was issued right here. So we'll go ahead and show you that very quickly right here. If we can pull that up. I don't know if we can pull that up for you for a second. I guess it's not I guess it's not popping up on the website right now. But what I was getting from my guys at Storms United was essentially what we were seeing was a bit of a decrease in the forecasts for the El Nino from July, August to September. That's going to be more of a 50-50 shot now, and more of a spike in the probability for August, September, and October, which if that was the case, that's very bad news right there, because essentially the best conditions and the best transition for an active hurricane season is for it to start off as an El Nino, then get down to neutral by around June, and then get to the La Nina phase by late August or early September. That's a worst case scenario, because essentially what neutral means is it still is going to weaken the trade winds from what the El Nino was doing previously to that. And we're already seeing that right now, and we're starting to see that shift from El Nino to neutral from what we were taking a look at from last year. And another thing I'm concerned about is just this wind shear does not look the kind of the same menacing thing we were seeing at this point last year. Now, again, some of it could be attributed to a few other things. However, that's a concern I'm paying attention to. And as we continue into the forecast at this current point, yeah, you're going to see those fluctuations. You're going to see a bit of an increase of wind shear with the ridge associated right there, but it's not nearly as pronounced as what we were seeing. Hell, even like this point last year, we were seeing a lot of wind shear up here in the mid-Atlantic. We are seeing a lot of wind shear more or less in the Gulf of Mexico. You're not seeing as much anymore. There's still quite a bit of wind shear in the Caribbean Sea, don't get me wrong, but there's not nearly as large of an area of that happening than there was before. So we're going to have to keep very close tabs on that. Another thing we're watching too is the dry air and the Sahara air layer. And I told you guys this in yesterday's video, but the Sahara air layer compared to where we were last year is not nearly as strong. There's not nearly as much Sahara dust in the Atlantic. There is still a lot, don't get me wrong, but it's not as much as what we were seeing last year, let alone 2 years ago. The reason 2022 was not an active hurricane season, at least it was around average, but you get the idea. Yes, there was Ian, but at least in Atlantic-wise, it wasn't particularly that active. We can go ahead and pull up the 2022 hurricane season. Yeah, there were 14 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes. The average was 14.4, 7.2, and 3.2, so it was around average. But the reason it wasn't more active was because of this Sahara air layer right there. There was so much dry air and so much Sahara dust that persisted, because essentially what happened was the monsoon season in the Sahel, which is the region just south of the Sahara, ended up starting much later than we initially anticipated. And we did have a little bit of a late start with this monsoon period, but it kind of made up for it for how powerful it's been. So with that being said, the reason I'm mentioning Africa and the reason I'm mentioning Sahara, Sahel, and everything like that is because it is very relevant to how active this hurricane season could get as we get into later in July, as we get into August, as we get into September. And we can go ahead and show you that moisture component right here. You see the moisture just organizing and developing in much of the main development region. You start seeing more active periods of the intertropical convergence zone, and you don't see as much dry air across a lot of these regions. You don't see nearly as much Sahara dust, which is, again, a very concerning thing to take a look at. And you're also noticing the Bermuda High is starting to organize and develop at a much quicker rate than what we were seeing. The Bermuda High usually doesn't start to get its act together until late July, early August, and usually it's the Azores High that is very powerful in the month of July. I remember this in my tropical class that I took last semester. But the fact that we're seeing the presence of a Bermuda High already in the season is pretty concerning, to say the very least, because what the Bermuda High does, it essentially is your steering currents for these tropical cyclones and for these hurricanes, ladies and gentlemen. So ultimately what that means is that the Bermuda High is kind of what's driving these systems towards closer to land, towards whether it's the Antilles, whether it's the Caribbean, whether it's Central America, or whether it is the United States. So that's something I am paying attention to at this current point in time. And regardless of what happens, it's going to be very concerning and very scary to see what happens down the road. And that's why I'm going to be keeping you guys updated over the next few weeks. That's why I'm not going to slow down the videos or anything like that, because every minute detail that changes and every change that there is in the Atlantic, I want to be there to report, and I want to be there to kind of explain to you what's going on, because this isn't a situation where it's going to be one hurricane and done. We're looking at possibly a very sustained and very powerful period in the hurricane season, ranging from around the last week of July or the first couple of weeks of August all the way to potentially the end of October. That's when the active period is typically climatologically, but especially this year with everything that's going on, that's why I'm paying attention to it so much. So forgive me if it seems like I'm harping on this too much, but I want to emphasize why I'm doing this and why I'm doing the stuff I'm doing. Granted, I'm not going to be posting tomorrow because I'm going to be traveling, but I will have a video out on Saturday just to kind of give you another update of what's going on with that. But anyway, that's kind of besides the point. Another thing I want to take a look at too is weather nerds. I want to see what the ensembles are thinking when it comes to tropical development. I personally do not expect really much to be happening in the next 10 days or so I wouldn't be that worried. Yeah, there's really not much going on. The most concerning thing I'm note is tropics-wise is this thing approaching the Carolinas, and that's going to be mainly a flash flooding threat and not really a hurricane or tropical storm threat. But regardless, I am still paying attention to these forecasts right here, and I'm still paying attention to these very concerning ensemble forecasts right here. And I want to go ahead and pull up the GFS ensembles 12 days out. Yeah, there is ensembles here and there, but there's not really that much because at least for right now, the Sahara air layer is kind of doing its job. Although there are cracks in that are starting to appear that I've noticed in the last 6 to 12 hours. You're starting to see another burst of convection firing up over here near the main development region. That's going to help moisten the atmosphere in the long term. You're starting to see another intrusion of moist air coming through much of the eastern Atlantic right there. So overall, it's something you need to continue to pay very close attention to, and something we need to get more data on. And another thing I'm continuing to be more concerned about. Another thing I'm concerned about right here is the global sea surface temperatures. The reason I continue to harp on this is because essentially what we saw last year was because of the El Nino, the steering currents were weaker than average, and it allowed for a lot of these tropical cyclones to stay out to sea and to stay pretty much around, pretty much off the in the Atlantic basin, pretty much, and not affect much land. We saw that with Hurricane Lee. We saw that with Tammy to some extent, although the Antilles did get impacted quite a lot. But overall, what that ended up doing is it did nothing to cool the Caribbean waters, because essentially it's kind of science right here, but essentially what hurricanes do, their purpose is to cool down the sea surface temperatures. Whenever they get too hot, a hurricane takes advantage to it. It causes a lot of upwelling, and it cools off the sea surface temperatures, especially September onward. But here's the problem. This is not September onward. It's July. And we still have 2 months of warming for the Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean Sea, Atlantic Basin, and the Western Main Development Region to ramp up with their sea surface temperatures, at least at this current point in time. Climate Reanalyzer continues to show a massive surge. We're already at 24 degrees Celsius across the entire Atlantic Basin, which, and for comparison from last year, we're up only about 1/10 of a degree below that, but that's mainly because Beryl happened, and it kind of caused this warming to level off for a few days. So that's what we're paying attention to on that aspect, and I fully expect this in the next week or so to overtake what we were seeing at least from last year. So we're going to have to keep an eye on it. OHC is another thing I'm paying attention to. There is going to be a little bit of fluctuation here and there, but you're going to see an overall surge of OHC in the Caribbean, especially in the deep Caribbean Sea. You're going to see a surge in the Gulf of Mexico, and you're going to see a surge in the Atlantic Basin and in the Western Main Development Region. You're also noticing a more concerning trend is a lot of those OHC values are starting to trend further and further and further to the north. So we're going to have to see how far north this ends up going before it kind of just stops and starts to recede further to the south as we get into September. But the fact that we're seeing this far of a trend to the north in July is pretty concerning, because even in 2020, I can go ahead and show you July 2020 very quickly before I end this video right here. Let's go ahead and show you that right here, July 2020. Yeah, it wasn't nearly there. It was kind of far to the north, but it wasn't nearly as far to the north in the eastern part of the main development region, and it wasn't as far north to some extent in the western part of the MDR, whereas what we're seeing right now, we can go ahead and show you that right here. Boom. We're seeing a lot more of a further north trend. And granted, this isn't a lot of OHC this far north, but the fact that we're seeing those trends further and further and further to the north as the years go on is very concerning to me, to say the very least. I'll keep you updated on all of this stuff here on the Pat's Path Predictor channel, but until that time, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Remember, we are trying to get to 10,000 subscribers by my 21st birthday, July 17th. This is something I've been doing for 3 years. I want to keep doing this But in order for me to do that, I need you guys to hit the red subscribe button. Also, like the video and leave a comment down below if you like the video or not. Remember, the goal of this channel, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. And if you want to come hang out with us at Storms United, we're just chilling. We're talking tropics right now. We actually got a new bot. Shout out Alex Baller for doing this right here. We got a new bot that will give us NHC updates right on the fly. So I'm really glad we have that addition at Storms United. I'm done rambling about that. Just come join us and check it out for yourselves. Link to that is right over there. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe.